On this podcast, you'll find interviews with high-performing, successful individuals in life sciences. On a weekly basis, we cover their proven methods, principles, strategies, and mindsets to implement new technologies that scale to meet the needs of people in our world.
Welcome to this episode of Life Science Success. Thank you for joining us. And before we get started here, I just wanted to mention our digital media marketing company, D3 Digital Media. We employ decades of life science experience and innovative technology to develop and define digital marketing strategies for healthcare companies so that they can build their digital voice, increase awareness, and drive leads, positioning themselves effectively in the competitive marketplace. So today on our episode of Life Science Success, my guest is Sharon Rogers. Sharon is the CEO of AmyriAD. Sharon brings the strength of her 35 years of pharmaceutical experience to AmyriAD. She's best known as the worldwide leader and development strategist for the highly successful AD treatment, Aricept. Aricept's been the standard of care for more than 20 years, and no other AD program has produced more compelling results. So with that, welcome, Sharon.
Thank you, and it's good to be here with you, Don.
Yeah, thanks a lot. I really appreciate it. And, there have not been very many people that have joined Life Science Success to talk about Alzheimer's treatments or, other types of drugs in this space. And so I'm really excited for this one and looking forward to our conversation.
Well, I'm sort of glad to be one of the few, and that makes our message all the more interesting for everyone.
Absolutely. So could you tell the listeners just a little bit about yourself?
I am just a person who lucked into having probably one of the most fantastic careers a person could have. How I got into pharma is a long and winding story, but somehow through a lot of things that I was doing throughout my life, I kept on tumbling over into this area. And by the time I got to graduate school, I realized that was really where I wanted to go. So I made sure that I honed my graduate curriculum around pharma, around ways to get in there and to do this type of work. And I have just been amazingly lucky and really happy.
Yeah, it sounds to me like you've definitely, worked as well, in this area for a long portion of time.
Mm-hmm.
Can you give the listeners just a little bit of a sense of some of the companies that you've worked for?
I started out in large cap pharma. That was my first job out of graduate school. And again, I was ready to come in and do this area that's called clinical pharmacology. And this is basically where you take something to the first doses in humans and you try to learn as much as you can about it, and does it do what you want it to do? And that's absolutely fabulous because it's quite experimental, but people sign informed consent, which is very different from laboratory animals that are just sort of trapped, and this is happening to them. So that part was appealing to the scientist in me to just do these studies and see, is it working? What are the side effects like? What is the movement of the drug through the body like? I mean, these are fabulous questions to answer, and it was quite exciting. So I started in large cap pharma, and I stayed in large cap pharma for probably 7 years. And then after that 7-year period of time, I was approached by a young startup in the US, and it was a very large company in its home territory, but it had no presence in the US. It wanted to become a worldwide leader, even though it was just sort of a small to moderate company in its home territory. And so that was an opportunity to be part of a startup where I was the 6th person hired.
Wow.
Which is from large cap pharma to 6th person hired,
right,
is a huge difference. But it was one with deep pockets, and it was one with a corporate infrastructure that was fundamentally sound. And so many of the things that you have to do in a regular biotech startup, I didn't have to do. It was easier for me to learn about how you start up a business through this. And that startup was Azi. And so Eisai is now considered to be exactly what Haruo Naito wanted it to be. It is a worldwide pharmaceutical leader. And I was part of that process. And I am always grateful to Eisai for giving me that opportunity and letting me run with it. I was relatively young, somewhat accomplished, but not that accomplished. And they put a lot of trust into me. And I always tried to make sure I didn't let them down.
That's excellent. It's an excellent story as well, and another contribution to your accomplishments overall. And then, what led you to AmyriAD from there?
Well, after I finished with Eisai, I did several years as an expat living in Japan and working at the home office. And I know we're going to talk about that, I think, a bit later. But you learn a lot as you're doing that. And one of the things that I thought about was, what am I going to do when this is over? How am I going to be different? Can I go back and do the same old, or do I need a different challenge? I'm quite a competitive person in a lot of ways, and it's usually competing to bring the best out of me. That's always the issue, bringing the best out of me. And I thought, what's gonna float my boat? What's going to be interesting from day to day? And so when I came back from that assignment, I did my first for real startup was venture capital and started learning that business. And that's what I've been and university. I was an associate professor at the University of Nevada for many years because that blends very well into consulting, startups, and still having a regular gig as an associate professor. And so everything was working out quite well. And what attracted me to AmyriAD, basically, it was the founders. The founders sought me out, and the founders knew about my work with this lead compound that they had at its original company, which was another startup. So one of the founders I actually knew from my earliest days when I was developing Aricept. And that was chair of psychiatry at Duke University, who was a really interesting person. We got along well intellectually. We cooked up a lot of interesting studies to do together to really explore what happens in Alzheimer's disease. And we always stayed in touch. He became very entrepreneurial himself. And as part of that, he founded the National University of Singapore Medical School for Singapore as a collaboration with Duke. And he was also working with a lot of venture capitalists starting up companies. And AmyriAD was one of those companies. And since he knew what the subject matter was and knew what my experience was, he tracked me down. I have no idea how because I keep a pretty low profile on social media.
Yeah, I saw that whenever I was trying to build things for the show as well, that that you definitely do, but at the same time, it's good that people that need to find you can track you down, regardless of whether or not if you're keeping a low profile or not.
Mm-hmm.
And then in terms of a lead candidate for drugs at AmyriAD, tell me a little bit more about what you guys are working on and what it is that you're looking to treat.
Okay, our lead compound is codenamed AD101, and AD is just a contraction of the name AmyriAD, the first letter and the last letter, but also it's serendipitously connected to our therapeutic area, which is Alzheimer's disease, also called AD. So AD101 is our lead compound. It is a drug that is a new class of compounds, and this was recently designated as such by USAN, which is the United States Adopted Names Organization, and IUPAC, which is another chemical naming organization based upon the data. What this drug is designed to do, it's designed to work through a well-known system of neurotransmission to improve cognition and global function in patients with Alzheimer's disease. And it's designed to be used in conjunction with the drug I previously developed, which was Aricept, or donepezil. Donepezil works through enhancing cholinergic neurotransmission. But the actions of most of the drugs that do this, they're not just confined to the central area. They are peripheral as well. And so the dose-limiting activity is a patient's ability to contend with peripheral side effects. This new drug, AD101, yes, it's cholinergic too, but its action is limited to the brain. It's very central. And so it can take what Aricept does and sort of pump up the volume, so to speak, in the area that matters, which is cognition and global function. And we've taken that through phase 2, examining it using standard FDA methodology and trial design, randomized, double-blind, placebo-controlled, just the way you're supposed to do studies, and found that it does exactly what we predicted it to do. And we're really very happy about that, and we're getting ready to move it into phase 3 trials because there isn't much out there for Alzheimer's patients. With most other drugs, especially for chronic conditions, there are a plethora of medications, and usually what happens is it's added on. Therapies are layered on to try to reach an optimal effect, and that really hasn't happened in Alzheimer's disease. We've had the past 20 years being devoted to looking at disease modification through the amyloid pathway, and what people have learned is that pathway in and of itself isn't enough. This is a very complex disease. It's got a lot of things that are going on in the brain and elsewhere. Many of the components are actually part of normal aging, but they work in a different way in Alzheimer's disease patients that end up causing more problems with cognition and function, robbing people of their individuality, of their ability to exist and function as an autonomous self. And so anything that we can do to give some of that back, regardless of how long that period of time may be, we see that as extremely worthwhile. So this is going to be layered onto Aricept. And with the newer drugs, the disease-modifying agent lecanemab comes to mind from my old company, AZI. Those drugs, too, don't stop the disease. They slow it down a little bit. And these treatments in and of themselves don't improve cognition and global function above baseline. Cholinergic therapies do. So what you can foresee is trying to delay amyloid accumulation and promote a healthier brain that way, adding in treatments like Aricept and AD101 to improve cognition and improve global function. And before you know it, instead of having people who are dying within 5 to 7 years in a very unpleasant way, you have people who are able to prevail for much longer because they're thinking clearly, they're functioning well, and you've slowed at least part of the pathologic process that is contributing to their disease.
Very interesting.
Yeah.
And then in terms of, I guess what would you expect then in terms of the phase 3 clinical trial? When will patients potentially start to see, this drug, in the marketplace?
The trials are one thing, the marketplace is something else. For disease modification therapies like AZI's lecanemab, just to give you a little idea of what that timeline was, they started working with BioArctic, talking about licensing in 2003. They finally initiated a license in 2007, 4 years later. And then it was fully 7 years later before they started talking to Biogen about co-development. And then finally, in the fourth quarter of 2022, you see the positive results from one trial. So you're talking about 19 years for a disease-modifying agent. The trials are quite long, they're very expensive, and again, it's complicated. It's about more than amyloid. On the other hand, for a symptom management, disease management trial like this one, the trial periods are shorter because if you have an effect, if upregulation of the neurotransmitter is going to cause a positive effect, it should be measurable and distinguishable from placebo within 3 weeks. And so what you do after that is you see what the durability of the effect is, and you examine the safety over time. So unlike a disease-modifying drug where you're talking about 19 years, soup to nuts, with us you're talking about maybe 5 years from the time that you enter phase 3 until the time your studies are done and you're on the market. And you can compress that time if you have more money to spend. Most companies will do something more sequential, but you can compress that timeline by doing the studies very close in sequence because you must do 2. That's a requirement from the FDA.
Yeah. Well, thank you for sharing that. I think it's important whenever we talk about, a lot of these treatments because, a lot of people, I think, if you just were randomly listening to a life science podcast, you could walk away with the idea that tomorrow there's going to be a drug on the shelf, and that's not how this process works.
No, but we owe a debt of gratitude to our patients and their caregivers. And so part of every program I have ever done is when we recruit patients to come into the double blind portion where they are risking taking placebo and not getting a benefit, I make sure we guarantee that once they finish that, they're able to go into what's called an open label extension. And during that period of time, we guarantee they will receive the drug. And they will continue to receive the drug until it is available in the marketplace.
Oh, very
Because
nice.
that's just something that you need to do. Plus, you're accumulating a lot of data on safety and, again, the durability of the effect that's very useful in understanding how to use the drug in every day-to-day patient practice.
So you talked a little bit about your experience in Japan, and I've had this experience, but not necessarily as an expat. So I've spent my fair share of time outside of the United States as well. And I'm just curious, did you bring any of the experience that you had as an expat in Japan to now what you use as a CEO?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I was a major traveler too for business. I probably spent 60% of my time on the road. And for Japan in particular, with Eisai, I was there roughly 4 times a year, usually for a week at a time. So like most people who don't know any better, I thought I would have this. I would understand what to do because I could get around town. I could go for my early morning runs. I was pretty functional in Japan. And when you live in another place, though, it's very different than visiting another place. And I made sure that I moved into a Japanese neighborhood, not an expatriate neighborhood, so that everything from going to the grocery store to the dry cleaner to what were still available then as video stores to just day-to-day activity, that I was deeply immersed in it. And I will say to anyone who has the opportunity to do an expatriate assignment, 3 years is the usual. Sometimes they extend a little bit longer. Some expatriates never come back because they enjoy that experience a lot. It is life-changing. You can never be the same person that you were, especially when the social construct is as different as a Japanese social construct. It's still very different in working in Europe, very different from the US. A lot of Americans don't always think that that's the case, but it's quite a bit different. But working in Japan is it's another dimension entirely. And I found it life-changing. And the main reason is because of perspective. It came at the right time in my career development too. I don't know if I would have been able to appreciate and take in all those differences if I were younger in my career. But learning how to negotiate with foreign governments is something too. You learn what they value. You learn what is important to them as a society. Simple things that we just don't even think about, you learn about them, and it provides a new dimension to one's character. So I'd say, if anything, my perspective is different. And I'm always looking with the people I'm negotiating with to try to figure out where are they coming from, what's their value system, what are they thinking about, what matters to them, and try to figure out what they're looking for in the interaction. Because 9 times out of 10, you can usually provide what someone needs out of the interaction. But if you don't know what that is, sometimes it's easy to run over what their opinion is or never hear it in the first place. And I look at that experience as being almost like it's like a secret sauce kind of thing.
Yeah, I definitely appreciated a few different things in the Japanese culture that I never thought that I would walk away with. And one that I'll never forget was, essentially just the sort of appreciation for people at different levels, right? And leaders that would sort of take time for their more junior associates, and just make sure that that they have some opportunities as well, especially if they saw things in them that they thought that these individuals would eventually be leaders themselves or whatever. I just felt like they really sort of coached people a lot better than US companies did, and US leaders did as well. So I mean, I definitely walked away with that as well.
I think I would have to agree with that. ASI is especially good about it. That's why they invited me over to serve an expat assignment. It's quite expensive to bring in expats to Japan. So they invest in you and you invest back in them. ASI is unique in that they send a lot of people to US to get US MBAs at the top universities because they want that perspective. They understand how essential it is to have a broad perspective. They do the same thing with a number of schools in Europe as well because they want to bring that perspective back into their company and benefit from it. So
Yeah.
it's a good deal.
So critical. In terms of you as a leader, what is the greatest leadership advice that you've ever received?
It was received by observation rather than verbally. You hear a lot of things verbally, and some of them are great and lines that you can sort of use as quips back. But I'd say there are two major principles that I adhere to, and I think any good leader should adhere to. The first one is you take total responsibility for the failures as a leader. Total responsibility. There's no hedging. The buck stops with you. There may be a lot of reasons within the company why something wasn't as successful as it could be, but you take responsibility for it at the end of the day. There's no squirming around on it. And that is important. Likewise, when there is a success, that belongs to everybody. And there is a whole lot of room on that celebration parade float. And you just want to pull everyone up that you possibly can to ride that celebration with you, to enjoy that success with you, because it would not happen but for them. So leaders can inspire, leaders can put people into improvement programs to help them be better, leaders can provide direction, but at the end of it, when that celebration comes, everyone gets a ride. So probably those things.
So important. I mean, that's a great, pinnacle as well, to remember overall as a leader, in terms of pulling people along. One of the things, especially, given today, it is hard to attract top talent to any organization. And you hear it repeatedly throughout our industry. And one of the things that I oftentimes, sort of question is, well, what is the view of your organization outside of, your organization? And then secondly, how do you celebrate the people that are inside of a company? It's one thing to say that you have competitive benefits and other things, but when you stand out as a leader in terms of somebody that pulls people along and accelerates their momentum, that's really a testament overall to who leaders are.
Everyone benefits when you do that. With every candidate I look at, I try to look at what is it they don't know about this job that they would be able to learn that would be an asset to them, and do I think they can figure it out? Right. And those are the two key things, because there are some people who, when they come in, they don't have the skill sets necessarily to do the job. Certainly I didn't. My first job in pharma, I went out of graduate school. I sent a bunch of letters out to pharma companies telling them how wonderful I was. And I got some nibbles and I got a job. And I was so grateful that I knew that my job was to figure out, okay, now how do I do this? I know nothing about pharma. How do I do it? So you look for people with that kind of hunger, and also people who you're confident that they're logical, they're well-reasoned, that their science background is good, and that they will figure it out. And many times you have to let them figure it out. You don't want to do it exactly for them unless you feel like it's really going off on the deep end, and then you rush in to help it along. But I like to give people challenges. And I've not been failed by that methodology so far.
Yeah. It's amazing sometimes to see, you give somebody something significant that, you even question yourself. This will be a test of this individual overall. And that as a leader, but at the same time, it's the best way to make them extend themselves and sort of figure it out, along the way as well.
Yes,
so there are three. Go ahead. Sorry.
I'm sorry. They have ownership.
Yes, I agree.
They know the opportunity is good. They know that. Right. And they will do amazing things.
So there are three questions that I like to ask every guest. What inspires you?
What inspires me is resilience. Resilience is an amazing quality. Some people have it by the boatload. Some people have very little of it. I see it a lot in Alzheimer's disease, patients who are more resilient to the effects that are going on in their body and patients who aren't. I value resilience because there are some people who've gone through some horrific things in their life, but they're able to prevail above that. And that's one of those things where I don't know exactly what the key is. I don't know if it's epigenetic, just straight up genetic, what makes it happen. But resilience is amazing. It's an amazing thing to watch. It's an amazing skill set to have. So yes, I find that completely and totally inspiring when I see that in people who have overcome many odds and they just keep trucking along.
Yes, yeah, I agree. What concerns you?
Sort of the reverse of that, complacency. Complacency, and particularly, I'd say right now in the current era, we have a lot of outrage fatigue. And people are very distressed for a number of reasons that are beyond their control, and they feel like they can't do anything as individuals. And in psychiatry, when developing drugs for psychiatric disorders, there's a model called learned helplessness, where people just get to the point where the insult keeps happening over and over again, so they just stop. They just stop, they just give it up. And that is outrage fatigue. It is also sort of one version of complacency. People who are very self-satisfied, yes, they can be complacent too, and that can be annoying. But a complacency where people feel like they've lost this hope that things could be better with their efforts, that's the one that distresses me the most.
Yeah, it is interesting though too to think about where you started with social media as well. I mean, there's just there's a very vast amount of our population that is directly influenced on their daily journey, just in terms of the overall impact of what's being said on social media. And then added to that, you could have the same exact level of just, being worn out from getting that same negative message all the time.
Over and over and over again, and having a system let them down over and over and over again, or they feel like it's let them down because the message that keeps being beamed to them is that, yes, this is happening and this is bad. And there's not much hope in that. And you have to be extremely resilient to be able to address outrage fatigue.
Absolutely. Last question. What excites you?
Oh, that one's easy. Gen Z. Gen Z excites me for a lot of reasons. They're going to make mistakes. They're going to do things wrong. They're going to be obnoxious. But at the same time, they are going to leave a footprint. And in many ways, maybe it's because of my own generation. I come from late 60s, early 70s. So we were very much involved in getting vote for 18-year-olds, which wasn't in place back in that time. The Roe v. Wade situation, regardless of how you feel about that, but certain rights to privacy, certain civil rights, all these things were products of late 60s, early 70s. And I almost feel like that spirit is part of Gen Z's DNA. And so while people will not always like the things that they say, if you say only things that people like, you're not going to be very successful at change. And so they excite me a lot.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Sharon L. Rogers, thank you so much for being on the Life Science Success podcast. I greatly appreciate you being here and sharing with us the story of AmyriAD and the things that you're working on. Thanks a lot.
Thanks a lot to you too. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for listening to Life Science Success. For complete details about this podcast, including show notes, how to get in touch with guests, and more episodes, please visit www.lifesciencesuccess.com. If there's someone you'd like for us to invite to the show as a guest, please let me know by sending me a message at the podcast website. Please click subscribe on your favorite podcast app, share the podcast, or tell a friend about it. And last but not least, rate the podcast. Thank you again.